across jagged coastlines and isolated islands, lighthouses rise like solitary sentinels, their beams cutting through darkness and storm. Yet behind these guardians of the sea are more unsettling truth lingers, keepers who disappeared without a trace, leaving towers fully operational but bereft of the humans who tended them. These vanishings are not mere accidents or maritime mishaps, they're enigmas that defy explanation, where every log, every routine inspection only deepens the mystery. Step into the wind-swept towers, feel the chill of spray-lashed rocks, and sense the isolation that gripped those who kept the lights burning. Trace the hazardous paths across storm-tossed shores and cliffs, examine the careful routines left unfinished, and witness the locations where inexplicable disappearances occurred. From the icy Scottish Isles to the perilous reefs off Maine and Cornwall, each site a silent testament to danger, endurance, and the mysteries that remain unsolved. The Flannan Isles mystery. Far out in the North Atlantic, beyond the rugged coast of Scotland's Outer Hebrides, a small cluster of barren rocks rises from the sea where powerful swells break endlessly against cliffs. Among them stands Eilean Moor, the largest island of the Flannan Isles, a remote and windswept outpost where the Atlantic wind rarely falls silent, and the surrounding waters have long been feared by sailors navigating the narrow passage known as the Minch. At the very top of this lonely island, perched more than 200 feet above the crashing surf, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse was built to guide ships safely past one of the most treacherous stretches of coastline in northern Scotland. For the keepers assigned to maintain the light, the station was both a workplace and an isolated world where weeks could pass without seeing another person. The lighthouse had only been in operation for a short time when the most famous mystery in its history began to unfold. The tower was completed by the Northern Lighthouse Board in 1899 after years of planning and construction in difficult conditions. Building the station required hauling heavy stone and equipment up cliffs, where waves often battered the landing place below, and once the lighthouse was finished, the same harsh environment became part of daily life for the men who kept the light burning through the long northern nights. At any given time, 3 keepers lived on the island, while a 4th remained on the mainland waiting to relieve one of the men at the end of a scheduled shift. By December 1900, the station was staffed by Principal Keeper James Duckett and 2 assistants, Thomas Marshall and Donald MacArthur. All 3 were experienced lighthouse keepers who understood the discipline required to maintain a remote station. Their duties followed a strict routine that governed nearly every hour of the day, from trimming the lamp and polishing the lenses to monitoring weather conditions and recording observations in the lighthouse logbook. In such a place, routine was essential because the sea allowed little room for mistakes. The isolation of the Flannan Isles was profound, even by the standards of lighthouse service. Eilean Moor itself was uninhabited except for the lighthouse crew, and the nearest settlements lay many miles away across cold, unpredictable water. Supply vessels visited the island at regular intervals, bringing food, fuel and mail, while also exchanging one keeper with the relief man waiting on shore. When storms swept across the North Atlantic, those visits could be delayed for days, leaving the keepers alone with the sound of wind and surf echoing through the empty cliffs. On the evening of December 15, 1900, a passing vessel noticed something unusual. The steamer Arctur, travelling through the Minch on its way from Philadelphia to Leith, passed close enough to the Flannan Isles for crew members to observe the lighthouse tower. Normally, the bright beam of the lantern could be seen sweeping across the sea as night approached, but on that evening the light appeared to be dim. The observation was noted, although it did not immediately cause alarm. In such harsh weather, temporary problems with the lamp were not unheard of. Within days, the situation began to attract greater concern. The Northern Lighthouse Board's supply ship, the Hesperus, had originally planned to visit the station earlier in December, but had been delayed by severe winter weather. When the vessel finally approached the Flannan Isles on December the 26th, the crew expected to see the usual signs of activity from the keepers above the landing place. Traditionally, one of the men would watch for the supply ship and come down the steep path to greet it when it arrived. That morning, the island appeared strangely silent. The captain of the Hesperus, James Harvey, later described how no signal flag had been raised and no keeper waited at the landing stage. The lighthouse tower stood high above the cliffs exactly as it should, but the surrounding slopes showed no sign of movement. At first, it seemed possible that the keepers had simply not noticed the ship's arrival, though such an oversight would have been unusual at a station where visiting vessels were rare. After several attempts to attract attention with the ship's horn, Harvey ordered a small boat to be lowered. Joseph Moore, the relief keeper who had been assigned to replace one of the men on Eilean Moor, climbed aboard and began the difficult approach to the island. The sea below the cliffs was restless, forcing the boat's crew to time their movements carefully before reaching the landing place carved into the rock. As Moore stepped onto the island, the silence deepened. He began the steep climb toward the lighthouse buildings, following the narrow path that wound upward from the landing stage to the station at the summit. Normally, the keepers would have been aware of his arrival long before he reached the top, yet the path remained empty. The only sounds came from the wind sweeping across the grass and the distant roar of waves far below the cliffs. When Moore reached the lighthouse compound, he immediately noticed that something was wrong. The main entrance door stood closed, but there was no sign that anyone had recently passed through that yard. Inside the living quarters, the lamps were unlit and the rooms felt strangely abandoned. The kitchen table held signs that a meal had been prepared not long before, yet no one remained to finish it. Moore continued his search through the station, calling out for the 3 men who should have been there. He checked the sleeping quarters and the storerooms, then climbed the stairs of the tower itself, expecting perhaps to find one of the keepers working at the lantern. The lamp had been cleaned and refilled, and the mechanisms appeared to be in proper condition, but the lantern room was empty. Realizing that the station had been left unattended, Moore returned to the landing place and signalled the crew of the Hesperus. Soon, the captain and several sailors climbed up the path to inspect the lighthouse themselves. Together they began to piece together the quiet clues left behind by the vanished keepers. One detail quickly drew attention. 2 sets of oilskins, the heavy waterproof coats worn by lighthouse keepers during storms, were missing from their usual hooks near the door. The 3rd set remained hanging where it had been left, suggesting that one of the men had gone outside without putting on the protective gear normally required when facing winter seas. Another unusual detail involved the station's clocks. At least one had stopped, although it was not clear exactly when this had occurred. The interior of the lighthouse showed no signs of violence or struggle, and the beds appeared to have been used in the normal way. Nothing inside the building suggested that the men had planned to leave the station for long. Attention soon turned to the logbook, where lighthouse keepers were required to record daily observations about weather conditions and events on the island. The final entries had been written by Thomas Marshall in the days leading up to the disappearance. Those entries described severe winds and rough seas striking the island during the middle of December, conditions that would not have been unusual for that time of year, but which still demanded caution from anyone working near the cliffs. One entry recorded strong winds, unlike anything the keeper claimed to have seen in years. Another mentioned that Donald MacArthur had been unusually quiet, though the meaning of that remark has remained uncertain. The final logbook entry was dated December 15, 1900, the same day the passing steamer later reported that the lighthouse appeared dark. What happened after that moment was never recorded. Outside the lighthouse buildings, further clues appeared along the western landing area, a place where the keepers sometimes worked to secure equipment or monitor the sea during storms. Investigators discovered that some storage boxes used for mooring ropes had been damaged or displaced. A large iron box that had been fastened to the rock was found broken open, and a section of railing along the cliff path showed signs of damage consistent with powerful waves striking the shore. The scene suggested that a violent storm had swept the landing place sometime around the middle of December, possibly while the keepers were outside attending to their duties. The cliffs below that area dropped sharply into deep water, and waves breaking against the rocks could send powerful sprays high above the shoreline during extreme weather. Captain Harvey and the crew of the Hesperus searched the island thoroughly that day. They examined the rocky slopes, the narrow gullies carved into the island's interior, and the edges of the cliffs that overlook the restless Atlantic. No trace of the 3 men could be found. The Northern Lighthouse Board soon launched a formal investigation into the disappearance. Robert Muirhead, a superintendent responsible for inspecting lighthouse stations, travelled to Eilean Moor to examine the evidence more closely. His report carefully described the damaged equipment at the landing place and the absence of any clear sign that the keepers had returned to the lighthouse after venturing outside. Muirhead concluded that the most likely explanation involved an accident during a violent storm, According to his theory, one of the keepers may have gone down to the landing area to secure equipment that was being threatened by the rising sea. When the man failed to return promptly, the other two may have followed to assist him, leaving the lighthouse unattended for a short time. In the darkness and chaos of a powerful storm, a sudden wave could have swept across the rocks and carried all three men into the sea. The explanation seemed plausible given the conditions known to exist around the Flannan Isles, where waves generated by Atlantic storms can reach tremendous heights when they collide with the cliffs. Yet certain details remain difficult to reconcile. Lighthouse keepers were trained to avoid unnecessary risks during storms, and leaving the station without supervision would have violated the strict rules governing lighthouse operations. Another question involved the oilskins left hanging inside the station. If a severe storm had been raging, it seemed unusual that one of the men would have ventured outside without wearing protective gear. The logbook entries themselves added to the uncertainty because they described dramatic weather conditions at a time when nearby coastal stations had not reported storms of comparable intensity. Over the years, the mystery has inspired numerous theories that attempt to explain what might have happened on that isolated island in December 1900. Some have suggested that an enormous rogue wave could have swept across the landing area without warning, overpowering the keepers before they had time to escape. Others have speculated that a sudden landslide or rockfall may have knocked the men into the sea. A few writers have even explored more imaginative explanations involving secret conflicts, hidden tensions among the keepers, or unexplained phenomena tied to the ancient folklore surrounding the Flannan Isles. Long before the lighthouse was built, local shepherds were said to visit the island only briefly, believing it to be a place where strange forces lingered among the cliffs. Yet none of those ideas has ever been supported by evidence. What remains certain is that the three keepers assigned to Elian Moor disappeared sometime between December the 15th and December the 26th, 1900, leaving behind a lighthouse that continued to stand watch over the surrounding sea. Their bodies were never recovered and no definitive explanation for their disappearance has ever been established. After the investigation concluded, new keepers were assigned to the station, and the Flannan Isles lighthouse continued to operate for decades as an important navigational aid for ships passing through the Minch. The lantern still shone across the water each night, sweeping its beam over the same dark waves that had surrounded the island on the night the light briefly failed. Even today, the mystery of the vanished keepers remains one of the most enduring stories in maritime history, a quiet enigma preserved in logbook pages, official reports, and the empty cliffs of a remote Atlantic island where three men stepped into the storm and were never seen again. The disappearance at Great Isaac Cay Lighthouse. Few structures in the Bahamas stand as isolated as the iron lighthouse rising above the small coral island of Great Isaac Cay, a lonely station that would later become linked to the unexplained disappearance of the man assigned to keep its light burning. Unlike larger, more accessible islands in the chain, Great Isaac Cay is little more than a narrow strip of coral and sand, often battered by relentless winds and surrounded by shallow reefs that conceal sharp rocks beneath deceptively calm waters. For centuries, mariners had charted its position carefully, wary of the hidden dangers around the tiny cay, but the construction of a lighthouse transformed it from a warning on a map into a post of human responsibility, though one man would eventually vanish without a trace while performing that duty. Mariners navigating the northern edge of the Bahamas have long relied on the tall skeletal tower of Great Isaac Cay Lighthouse, a navigational beacon positioned near the busy routes connecting the Florida Straits with the scattered islands of the Atlantic. Its light, projected across open water, served as a critical guide to vessels travelling between Florida and the Bahamian archipelago, where shifting currents and coral reefs posed constant threats. Unlike the grand stone towers of the North Atlantic, this lighthouse relied on iron and metal frameworks designed to withstand the tropical storms that swept through the region, yet its isolated location meant that the station remained largely untended for days at a time, dependent entirely on the keeper assigned to its care. Construction of the lighthouse in the 19th century transformed what had once been an uninhabited cay into a vital point of navigation, yet the island itself remained a harsh and unforgiving environment. Sand and coral covered most of the surface, leaving little room for natural shelter, while the surrounding waters offered both sustenance and danger. Storms could arise without warning, whipping the shallow surf into a froth of breaking waves, and the heat of the sun reflected off the coral by day, making the station both physically taxing and psychologically isolating. The keeper stationed there faced not only the practical challenges of maintaining the light, but also the endless monotony and solitude that came with living on a tiny island far from the mainland. Daily life for the keeper unfolded in near total solitude, defined by routines designed to maintain both the lighthouse and the light itself. The lamp required constant attention, refilling fuel, cleaning lenses, and ensuring that the rotating mechanisms functioned precisely. Observations of weather patterns were recorded meticulously, and the surrounding sea was monitored for approaching ships or signs of danger. With no other residents on the quay and supply boats arriving only intermittently, the keeper existed in a world defined entirely by repetition, observation, and the rhythm of the tides. It was within this isolation that the disappearance would occur, a stark reminder of the vulnerability inherent in such remote posts. At some point during the 20th century, the quiet routine of the station was reportedly interrupted by an event that would later become the centre of a persistent maritime mystery: the disappearance of the lighthouse keeper assigned to Great Isaac Cay. Historical records are sparse, but accounts suggest that the man vanished while performing his duties, leaving the station intact and showing no outward signs of struggle or distress. The lighthouse remained functional, its light continuing to shine across the surrounding waters, yet the absence of the keeper created an immediate and haunting question: how could a solitary man disappear from such a small island without any clear trace? Accounts describing the discovery of the empty station suggest that the lighthouse itself remained largely undisturbed, an unsettling detail that raised questions among sailors and later investigators. Doors were found closed as if the keeper had simply stepped outside for a moment, yet he never returned. Supplies and personal effects appeared undisturbed, and no signs of violence or disorder were recorded. The vanishing left no clues that could point toward an accident, foul play, or voluntary departure. In a place so exposed to both the elements and the ocean's unpredictable forces, the complete absence of physical evidence deepened the mystery rather than offering answers. Unlike many maritime accidents where wreckage or witnesses eventually reveal what happened, the circumstances surrounding the missing keeper left very little to examine. Nobody was recovered, and nearby vessels reported no signs of distress or unusual activity around the quay at the time. Subsequent visits to the lighthouse found the station in working order, but the man who had once maintained it was never seen again. Even the historical accounts that document the event remain brief, limited to references in nautical logs, and the recollections of passing sailors who noticed that the lighthouse appeared unattended. Each fragment of information reinforces the sense of an event that defies easy explanation. The environment surrounding Great Isaac Cay, however, offered several dangers that lighthouse keepers understood well. The Florida Straits are known for swift, unpredictable currents, and sudden squalls can transform calm waters into violent seas within minutes. Shallow reefs ring the island, hidden just below the surface, capable of damaging vessels or sweeping an unwary person into the ocean. Even with careful attention to conditions, a keeper venturing near the shoreline would have faced a serious risk from waves, rocks, and the surrounding reefs, all amplified by the absence of anyone nearby to offer aid or witness the event. Nature itself could have acted swiftly and without warning. Even experienced keepers working along the Bahamian chain knew that a single misstep near the water's edge could prove fatal, especially in places where the terrain and the currents left little margin for error. A moment of distraction, a misjudged step, or a sudden swell could sweep across the quay with devastating force. The harsh environment required constant vigilance, and yet it could never eliminate the element of unpredictability, the very factor that may have contributed to the keeper's disappearance. Over time, the story of the vanished keeper became part of the quiet lore surrounding the island, repeated in fragments by sailors and researchers who encountered references to the unexplained disappearance. The lighthouse has continued to function for decades, its beam still tracing a path over the same waters where one man was last seen. The event remains a cautionary tale in the annals of maritime history, a reminder of the isolation, danger, and inexplicable nature of life on remote lighthouses in regions where the sea dominates all else. At present, the lighthouse still stands above the pale sand and coral rock of Great Isaac Cay, its tower visible from the surrounding waters where ships continue to pass through the same busy maritime corridor. Though modern technology and automated systems now reduce the need for continuous human presence, The memory of the vanished keeper lingers, entwined with the image of the lonely iron tower standing firm against the sun, wind, and tides of the Atlantic. Somewhere between the silent tower and the shifting currents of the Florida Straits, the fate of the lighthouse keeper who vanished from Great Isaac Cay remains completely unknown. The keeper lost at Stannard Rock Lighthouse. Maintaining one of the most remote lighthouses in North America required constant vigilance, a fact underscored by the mysterious disappearance of a keeper from Stannard Rock. Unlike other posts along the Great Lakes, this station demanded a combination of physical endurance, technical skill, and careful attention to routine, where a single lapse could have catastrophic consequences. For the men who lived atop the narrow iron tower, life was measured in hours spent tending the lamp, recording observations, and watching the ever-changing surface of Lake Superior, knowing that the lake itself could turn against them without warning. Every hour on the tower was dictated by the precise operation of the lamp, the recording of weather observations, and the careful monitoring of water levels, a routine that left little room for error. The lantern, perched atop the cylindrical structure, required constant maintenance. Wicks had to be trimmed, lenses cleaned, and mechanisms oiled to ensure the beam remained visible to passing ships. Logs were filled with meticulous notes tracking wind, temperature, and wave conditions. But even the most disciplined record could not account for the capricious nature of the lake or the unpredictable hazards posed by the surrounding ice. Even minor mechanical failures could become life-threatening, forcing keepers to act quickly while surrounded by nothing but the cold expanse of water. A jammed clockwork mechanism or a malfunctioning lamp could leave vessels unaware of the rock's location, creating a ripple effect that could endanger ships miles away. In such moments, keepers were acutely aware that their responsibility was not only to themselves, but to countless others relying on the light, a weight that heightened the tension inherent in their isolated existence. Constructing and maintaining Stannard Rock Lighthouse was a feat of engineering that alone underscores the harshness of the post. Workers had to pour concrete atop a barely stable reef, while waves pounded the rock relentlessly, and iron plates were riveted under conditions that would challenge the strongest crews. Keepers lived in a tower designed to endure the lake's fury, but comfort was secondary to structural integrity. Even minor repairs or adjustments demanded attention, skill, and courage, knowing that a slip on the wet iron or a misstep along the narrow catwalk could have fatal consequences. The isolation of the post demanded both endurance and discipline, with weeks passing without human contact and all supplies arriving only by treacherous boat journeys. Relief crews and supply boats were rare, often delayed by storms or shifting ice that made docking nearly impossible. Meals were stored in the small pantry heated on a modest stove, while living quarters consisted of narrow bunks stacked against the walls. The psychological strain of confined spaces, long nights and constant vigilance amplified the already extreme dangers imposed by Lake Superior. For the keeper who vanished, such isolation may have magnified the peril in ways that no record can fully capture. Daily life also involved a constant negotiation with the environment. Ice build-up in winter could coat the tower, making stairs and walkways slippery and treacherous. Summer storms brought sudden violent gusts and waves that could sweep over the base of the rock. Fog often descended without warning, reducing visibility to near zero, leaving the keeper alone in the grey expanse, tasked with keeping the light functioning. Every action required careful attention, yet even the most cautious man remained vulnerable to the lake's unpredictable temperament. At some point, that discipline was interrupted when one keeper vanished, leaving the lighthouse fully functional yet completely abandoned. Historical records provide little beyond the fact of disappearance, but what is clear is that the station itself offered no clue. Tools were in place, logs continued up to the day of his absence, and the light remained operational. The eerie precision of this abandonment, the complete continuation of routine mechanisms without the human hand that maintained them, adds to the enduring enigma. Investigators and subsequent crews found the tower orderly, but could not explain the sudden disappearance. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of voluntary departure, and no accounts from nearby vessels indicating a sighting or distress signal. The rock's small size and isolation made it highly improbable that someone could leave unnoticed under normal circumstances, yet somehow the man vanished entirely. Every careful measurement of the lighthouse and surrounding lake produced only more questions. The mechanisms worked, the lamp shone, the logs recorded, but the keeper was gone. The hazards of the station compounded the mystery. Icy spray, unpredictable waves, and the constant threat of storms made the rock a perilous workplace, even in the best conditions. Lake Superior's reputation for sudden squalls and towering waves was well earned. Ice flows could shift without warning, and water temperatures near freezing increased the danger of exposure to life-threatening conditions. Even the strongest swimmers or most experienced sailors would have struggled to survive an accidental fall into the lake in winter, making the disappearance plausible under natural but extreme circumstances, yet still unexplained given the lack of physical evidence. Trips to and from the mainland or nearby islands involved navigating dangerous currents, shifting ice and strong winds. Supply boats often waited for days for a lull in storms before attempting landings, and many crews noted the difficulty of maintaining regular contact with the rock. The keeper's vulnerability was constant. There was no escape, no nearby help, and every visit from the mainland was itself an exercise in caution. This constant exposure, combined with extreme isolation, heightened the mystery of the vanished keeper, suggesting that even routine activities could carry fatal consequences in such a hostile environment. Over time, accounts of the missing keeper became part of maritime lore, repeated in journals and reports but never fully explained. Ship logs from passing freighters occasionally mention the Iron Tower and the inhospitable rock, often reflecting on the courage required to serve there. Modern historians and lighthouse enthusiasts continue to examine the incident, noting how Stannard Rock's remoteness and environmental hazards make it a unique and perilous station. Yet no new evidence has surfaced, and the disappearance remains a cautionary tale of the hazards inherent in maintaining a lighthouse on one of the Great Lakes' loneliest outposts. Today, the lighthouse continues to operate, its mechanisms maintained, its light still sweeping across Lake Superior as it has for over a century, silent witness to the unknown fate of the man who once kept its watch. The tower endures storms, ice, and decades of isolation, but the human story it silently holds remains suspended, a testament to the dangers of extreme duty and the lake's indifference. Within the routine of the tower and the ceaseless expanse of the lake, the fate of the vanished keeper remains an enduring enigma. The vanishing at Sombrero Key Lighthouse. Long hours in sweltering heat and relentless humidity shaped every moment for the keeper of Sombrero Key Lighthouse, a post where isolation was as constant as the pounding of the waves. Unlike more accessible stations along the Florida Keys, this lighthouse required its sole occupant to maintain the light, monitor weather conditions, and ensure maritime traffic remained aware of the shallow coral reef beneath. Life here was defined by small repetitive tasks, yet each carried stakes far higher than they might appear. The remoteness of the reef meant that any error could be catastrophic, and for the man who vanished, those risks would intersect with the unknown in a way that no procedure could anticipate. Every task demanded painstaking care, from polishing lenses and winding clockwork to inspecting structural ironwork corroded by salt and storms. The tower, rising above the coral and water, was built on a shallow reef that frequently submerged under high tides, an engineering challenge that required careful maintenance to withstand hurricane-force winds and relentless salt corrosion. The lantern's Fresnel lens required cleaning, the oil reservoir had to be topped, and clockwork systems wound on schedule, all to maintain the steady pulse of the light visible for miles. One lapse, however brief, could spell disaster for passing vessels and, in the keeper's isolated existence, for himself. Tasks that seemed routine carried hidden risks. A momentary distraction or slip on the narrow walkways could have devastating consequences in the coral-strewn waters surrounding the reef. Iron railings and platforms, slick with salt spray and heat, offered little protection against the wind or sudden gusts that whipped across the tower. The reef itself formed jagged edges beneath deceptively shallow water, and the waves, even on calm days, could sweep a man from a boat or platform with astonishing speed. Awareness and caution were not just virtues, they were survival requirements, and yet the very nature of human error could never be eliminated. Supplies arrived infrequently, dependent on calm seas and the schedules of small boats travelling miles from the nearest inhabited keys, leaving the keeper largely alone for weeks at a time. Provisions had to be rationed carefully, and any equipment failure required improvisation until relief or resupply could arrive. Communication was limited, often relying on passing vessels or infrequent visits, leaving the lighthouse isolated from news or outside assistance. This enforced solitude heightened the weight of responsibility and the psychological strain of knowing that one's presence or absence could have consequences far beyond the tower itself. At some point, the keeper disappeared, leaving the lighthouse intact yet utterly abandoned, and every routine observation completed up until the moment deepened the mystery. Logs indicated that the light had been maintained, the mechanisms wound, and the tower secure. Nothing appeared amiss in the operation of the lighthouse itself. Only the absence of the man who kept it alive hinted at something extraordinary. The precision of the records, contrasted with the total lack of human presence, created a tension that would haunt sailors, lighthouse authorities, and historians for decades. Investigations revealed no signs of struggle or disorder, only a structure performing its duties mechanically, as if the absent keeper had simply dissolved into the sea and sky. Tools remained neatly stored, the oil reservoir was full, and personal effects were undisturbed. No eyewitness accounts or maritime logs recorded unusual weather or suspicious activity at the time. The paradox of a fully functional station with no human occupant became central to the ongoing mystery, challenging both logic and expectation, while leaving unanswered questions that continue to provoke speculation. The waters surrounding Sombrero Key offered subtle but ever-present threats. Sharp coral, shifting currents, and sudden squalls capable of sweeping a man into the Atlantic in seconds. Even outside hurricane season, the Atlantic could turn turbulent without warning. Tropical storms could form within hours, accompanied by heavy rain, fierce winds, and unpredictable waves. The coral reef itself posed constant danger, jagged and shallow, ready to destroy an unwary boat or make rescue nearly impossible. Each environmental factor, ordinary in isolation, combined to create a complex web of hazards that could claim a life with little evidence remaining. Even minor lapses, such as a boat delayed or a task interrupted, could expose a lone keeper to mortal danger, underscoring the unforgiving nature of life on a reef lighthouse. Tasks as simple as securing supplies, checking the lens, or observing approaching vessels required continuous attention. A misjudged step on the tower, a brief distraction during maintenance, or a sudden gust could easily precipitate a disappearance, especially in a location with no nearby help and few witnesses. The combination of isolation, tropical conditions, and human vulnerability amplified the tension surrounding every decision and movement. Daily routines included meticulous observation of passing ships, constant monitoring of tides and winds, and careful notation of all anomalies in the logbook. Each passing vessel could be both a reassurance and a reminder of the stakes, as even experienced sailors depended on the light to avoid the shallow reef. The keeper's life was a cycle of vigilance punctuated by the oppressive heat, relentless humidity, and unceasing motion of the Atlantic, yet he remained alone in the task that demanded both endurance and unwavering attention. Ships navigating the busy Florida Keys corridor relied on the lighthouse, heightening the stakes, as any misstep or disappearance could imperil vessels traversing these waters. Although the reef was small, it posed a significant navigational hazard for commercial and private vessels alike. Mariners depended on the lighthouse as a sentinel warning of shallow coral and treacherous tides, and the absence of a keeper, even for a brief period, could have had dire consequences. The responsibility carried by a single man isolated miles from land underscored the precarious balance between duty and danger. Accounts passed through the records of sailors, lighthouse enthusiasts, and historians, each retelling emphasizing the quiet, inexplicable tension of the reef and tower. Over time, references to the disappearance became part of Florida maritime law, quietly preserved in logs, journals, and the oral tradition of seafarers familiar with the offshore hazards. Each narrative highlighted the contradiction at the heart of the mystery. The lighthouse remained operational, the reef unchanged, yet the keeper had vanished without a trace, leaving only questions and the faint, steady pulse of the light. The tower continues its mission, its light sweeping across the Atlantic, silently marking the location of a man who vanished without leaving a trace. Its structure endures wind, salt, sun, and storm, yet the human story it contains remains frozen in time, a chilling reminder of the vulnerability of even the most experienced keepers. Amid the relentless sun, jagged coral, and sudden Atlantic squalls, the fate of the Sombrero Key keeper remains entirely unknown. the disappearance from Longships Lighthouse. Relentless surf and crashing tides battered the rocks surrounding Longships Lighthouse, and amid this unyielding assault, one keeper vanished without explanation. Perched on jagged outcrops several hundred metres from the Cornish coast, the lighthouse stood as a solitary sentinel against the Atlantic's fury. Built to warn ships of the perilous reefs below, it was a tower both essential and unforgiving, where every day demanded constant vigilance. The disappearance of its keeper sent shockwaves through the maritime community, not because the structure failed, but because a man could vanish entirely while the lighthouse carried on its work as if nothing had happened. Constructed from iron and stone to survive the Atlantic's fury, the tower demanded constant maintenance, leaving no room for oversight or error. Waves and spray battered its foundations with unrelenting force, corroding metal and chipping masonry in ways that only careful attention could arrest. The lantern required cleaning and polishing to maintain a clear beam, and the mechanical rotation system depended on precise winding. The very act of moving along the narrow walkways during a storm or even a gusty day presented risk, and the lighthouse's isolated position meant that any mishap could become fatal without witnesses or immediate assistance. Daily chores carried hidden danger, polishing the lantern, winding machinery, and examining masonry while wind and spray threatened every careful step. The keeper needed to balance the demands of a precise routine with the constant threat of exposure to the elements. Slippery surfaces, powerful gusts, and pounding waves created a landscape where one misstep could carry deadly consequences. Every action, even routine inspections, required acute focus, and the combination of fatigue, isolation, and natural hazards transformed ordinary duties into high-stakes survival. Sudden squalls surged off Cornwall's coast, isolating the lighthouse for days and rendering resupply boats powerless against the churning sea. Mariners attempting to reach the tower often found themselves forced to retreat, and storm surges would wash over the rocks with violent unpredictability. Even seasoned sailors approached cautiously, aware that the Atlantic around Longships was deceptively merciless. The keeper faced these storms alone, with only the tower and its mechanisms as companions, and each tempest amplified the dangers of an already inhospitable post. Every log and routine inspection noted precise maintenance, yet the keeper disappeared, leaving an operational tower and a puzzle that confounded authorities. The light continued its measured sweep over the dark waters, and the machinery ran smoothly despite the absence of the man who had tended it. Reports indicate that tools were in place, the oil reservoir was full, and no evidence of distress was recorded. The paradox of a fully functioning lighthouse and a vanished keeper challenged logic and remained unexplained, a testament to the Atlantic's capacity to both sustain and obscure. Officials and investigators found no footprints, signs of struggle, or anything that could explain his absence, only a lighthouse operating mechanically without its human guardian. Thorough searches of the surrounding rocks and nearby waters revealed nothing. Rescue attempts and inspections confirmed that the tower's operations were uninterrupted. No eyewitnesses saw a vessel approach or leave, no storm coincided precisely with the disappearance, and yet the man had simply vanished, leaving behind only the structure he had so meticulously maintained. Beneath the tower, submerged rocks and swift currents combined with rogue waves capable of sweeping a man into the Atlantic without leaving a trace. The interplay of tidal surges, undercurrents, and hidden reefs created an ever-present hazard. Even on calm days, sudden breaking waves could knock someone into the sea before help could arrive. These conditions, while familiar to the keeper, were unforgiving to any lapse in attention or misjudged step, highlighting how quickly human presence could be erased in such a hostile environment. Even minor tasks such as tightening bolts or checking the lantern could turn perilous, as gusts and ocean spray made simple actions life-threatening. Maintaining the lighthouse demanded precision, but the surrounding elements allowed no margin for error. Tools could slip from hands, surfaces could betray balance, and the relentless motion of the waves reminded the keeper that survival required constant vigilance. Such conditions amplified the mystery of his disappearance, for every routine task carried risk, yet no evidence of an accident was found. Ships navigating the treacherous stretch of the Cornish coast relied on the lighthouse's beam, highlighting how a single absence could have catastrophic consequences. Merchant vessels, fishing boats, and passenger ships depended on the light to avoid the jagged rocks and reefs that lurked beneath the Atlantic's surface. The tower's signal served as both guide and guardian, a lifeline for sailors whose paths intersected with the invisible hazards below. The vanishing of the keeper, therefore, was not merely a personal tragedy but a momentary breach in a system critical to maritime safety. Reports and recollections filtered through local maritime records, each emphasising the eerie fact of a fully operational lighthouse, yet an absent keeper. Accounts recorded by lighthouse authorities, sailors, and local historians focused less on speculation and more on the tangible contradiction. The mechanisms were in perfect order. The lights swept the horizon without pause, yet the human presence essential to the lighthouse's daily rhythm had disappeared completely. These records preserved the anomaly, embedding it in Cornwall's rich maritime history as a case that defied explanation. The tower's light continues its unbroken watch, silently guarding vessels against the jagged reefs, while the fate of the vanished keeper remains unsolved. Its beam sweeps across the dark Atlantic night, indifferent to the mysteries of the past, standing as a silent witness to the man who once tended it and then vanished without a trace. Above the jagged rocks, and beneath the eternal roar of the Atlantic, the mystery of the Longships' keeper endures, unanswered by time or tide. The mystery at Seguin Island Lighthouse. On a solitary island off the main coast, the Seguin Island Lighthouse stood steadfast while one of its keepers vanished without explanation, leaving only questions in the wake of a perfectly functioning station. Rising from the rocky outcrop at the mouth of Casco Bay, the lighthouse had long been a sentinel for ships navigating the treacherous waters of the Atlantic. Its beam cut through dense fog and storm, warning mariners of hidden reefs and sudden shoals. Yet despite the reliability of its light, the human presence required to sustain it could simply disappear, leaving behind a haunting paradox that neither mechanical precision nor natural explanation could resolve. Established in the late 18th century, Seguin Island Lighthouse was among the oldest in the United States, with its first beacon lighting the main coastline in 1795. Over the decades, it had guided countless vessels through fog-choked passages and violent coastal storms. Its enduring stone and brick construction had survived centuries of relentless Atlantic winters, salt spray, and gale-force winds. For generations, keepers maintained the lighthouse under conditions that were both unforgiving and isolated. A daily life of solitude punctuated by the distant echoes of ship horns and crashing waves. The disappearance of one keeper became all the more unsettling against this backdrop of historical continuity, a stark reminder of human vulnerability amid steadfast stone and steel. The lighthouse's design reflected the necessity of enduring nature's assaults. Thick masonry walls rose from jagged rock, reinforced to withstand waves that could sweep across the island during winter storms. The lantern room, positioned high above the water, housed a Fresnel lens that required meticulous care to ensure its beam remained clear and bright. Rotation mechanisms, powered by clockwork and requiring regular winding, demanded precision and focus. Every element of the structure had been engineered for resilience, yet it was dependent on the keeper's labour and attention, a human component rendered invisible when one morning it abruptly vanished. Daily life on Seguin Island was a series of exacting routines. Cleaning the lens, polishing brass fittings, winding the light's machinery, and meticulously recording weather observations occupied every waking hour. Each task, while repetitive, carried inherent danger. The walkways were narrow, slick with salt spray, and exposed to gusting winds. A momentary lapse could result in injury or worse, yet the keeper carried out these duties with mechanical consistency, a rhythm that the light itself seemed to echo. The very repetition of these chores, performed in isolation, created a tension that was quiet yet palpable, a slow burn of psychological strain. The keeper's quarters offered little comfort from the elements or the solitude. Cold stone walls and sparse furnishings provided shelter, yet the isolation was absolute, broken only by the ceaseless sound of waves battering the island's perimeter and the whistle of wind through the lantern room. Meals were simple and monotonous, often prepared in silence, while mail and supplies could take days to arrive. Even brief excursions across the island's rocky terrain carried risk, with the Atlantic ever present in its capacity to surprise and endanger. Over time, the unbroken solitude and constant vigilance shaped the daily experience, emphasizing human fragility against the relentless forces of nature. Extended periods of isolation could weigh heavily on any keeper, and the monotony of maintaining a single rotating beacon intensified the mental burden. Historical records of lighthouse life often note unusual behaviour and fatigue among keepers, stemming from both environmental exposure and the repetitive demands of duty. While there is no evidence that this played a direct role in the Seguin disappearance, the human element cannot be ignored. The mind under constant watch of the sea alone for hours and days is subject to pressures invisible to the outside world. These subtle strains, when combined with natural hazards, create a backdrop that is as compelling as it is mysterious. Maine's weather amplified the island's isolation and peril. Dense fog could settle over the bay in minutes, obscuring visibility and making travel to or from the island nearly impossible. Winter storms brought icy winds and snow, while sudden squalls turned calm waters into frothing chaos. Even minor tidal shifts created hidden hazards on the jagged rocks surrounding the lighthouse, making every step outside a potential risk. While the keeper was skilled and experienced, the environment itself demanded constant vigilance, a reminder that human presence on such an exposed post was always precarious. The disappearance itself was abrupt and baffling. One morning, the keeper did not appear at routine check-ins, and subsequent inspections revealed no signs of struggle or departure. Tools were in place, logs up to date, and the machinery functioning without interruption. The lighthouse continued its unbroken sweep across the bay, as though oblivious to the absence of the human hand that had sustained it for years. Investigators were confronted with a puzzle: a meticulously maintained station, operating flawlessly, yet the essential presence of its keeper had simply vanished. Searches of the island and surrounding waters yielded nothing. Nearby coves, rocky outcrops and tidal channels were scoured, yet no trace of the keeper was ever discovered. Official records documented the disappearance as an anomaly, one that could not be explained by accident, foul play or environmental hazard alone. Maritime authorities noted the continuity of operations, emphasizing the eerie contradiction of a lighthouse functioning with precision even in the absence of the man who had devoted his life to its care. Even as decades passed, the island retained an almost tangible sense of quiet and suspense. The waves rolled in, fog drifted over the rocky coastline, and the lighthouse's beam traced the horizon with unwavering precision. Visitors and historians alike have noted the subtle, haunting atmosphere, a structure built to command attention, yet somehow absorbing the mystery of the vanished keeper into its very walls. The human story lingers alongside the mechanical, the known and unknown intertwined in the sweep of light over an Atlantic night. These days, Seguin Island Lighthouse casts its steadfast beam across the Atlantic night, guarding the waters while the vanished keeper's fate remains a haunting question unanswered by time. The keeper who vanished from Boon Island Light. The keeper was last seen performing his duties, and by the next inspection he had vanished completely, leaving behind a lighthouse that functioned with eerie normality. Boon Island Light, perched atop a barren rock in the Gulf of Maine, had long been notorious for its isolation and treacherous surrounding waters, but even seasoned mariners were unprepared for the mystery that unfolded. The tower remained operational, the lens sweeping the dark sea with its steady arc as though nothing had happened, yet the human presence essential to its maintenance had disappeared entirely. The incident baffled authorities and maritime observers alike, leaving an enduring question: how could a man vanish without a trace in a place so meticulously maintained and constantly watched? Violent Atlantic waves and unpredictable currents had long been acknowledged as dangers by mariners, yet even these perils could not explain the total absence of the man entrusted to the station. The island itself was a jagged outcrop surrounded by shoals and submerged rocks, where waves could rise without warning and fog could reduce visibility to a few feet. Supplies could be delivered only in the calmest conditions, and even then, the boats had to thread carefully among rocks that had claimed countless vessels over the centuries. For the keeper, these waters were both livelihood and threat, a daily reminder of the raw power of the Atlantic and how quickly human effort could be swallowed. Accounts of shipwrecks and maritime tragedies surrounding Boon Island emphasized the lighthouse's vital role, and each event underscored the stakes for the lone keepers who lived there. The station had been constructed in the late 18th century, with a history steeped in peril. Shipwrecked sailors had once endured starvation and exposure on the rock, and countless vessels had foundered along the Gulf of Maine's unforgiving coast. The lighthouse was erected as a lifeline, a solitary beacon against the dark waters, yet it also became a place where isolation magnified danger. By the time of the disappearance, the station had seen generations of keepers, each familiar with its unique blend of duty and hazard, yet none had experienced an absence so inexplicable. Each task demanded exacting precision, from polishing the lens to winding the rotation mechanism, and any misstep could imperil the vessels that relied on the beam. The lighthouse required constant vigilance. Oil reservoirs had to be checked, the lens cleaned to prevent distortion, and the foghorn operated correctly during low visibility. Even minor lapses could reduce the beam's effectiveness or cause mechanical failure. The keeper's work was repetitive but exacting, a rhythm that left little room for error, and any negligence could have consequences far beyond the isolated rock. The fact that the tower continued to function flawlessly in his absence deepened the mystery and underscored how sudden and complete the disappearance had been. Solitude left its mark in subtle ways, with monotony and endless repetition eroding mental resilience, even in those most experienced with maritime service. Keepers endured long stretches without meaningful human contact, observing the unbroken sweep of the horizon and listening to the relentless pounding of the sea against stone. Letters from other stations and personal diaries from similar lighthouses attest to the psychological strain of such posts, where isolation could heighten anxiety and magnify danger. On Boon Island, this solitude was extreme. No nearby land, no passing ships visible most days, and storms that could last for hours or days. In such conditions, even routine decisions carried weighty consequences, and the absence of one keeper became all the more haunting against this backdrop of loneliness. Storms often struck without warning, challenging even routine movements along stairways, platforms, and ladders, making every action a careful negotiation with the elements. A gust could topple tools, a wave could wash over the platform, and the narrow staircases inside the tower could become treacherous under wet or icy conditions. Boats sent to resupply the lighthouse often had to turn back when the Atlantic grew violent, leaving keepers stranded until conditions improved. The combination of relentless weather and exposure made Boon Island Light one of the most dangerous postings on the east coast. Yet no record indicated that a storm coincided precisely with the disappearance, leaving investigators without a straightforward explanation. Inspection reports from the period reveal no hint of struggle, no note and no clue, only a man who had seemingly evaporated into the island's unforgiving conditions. Tools were in place, oil reservoirs full and logs up to date. Doors were secured, windows intact, and there was no evidence of foul play or accidental fall. The paradox of a functioning lighthouse and a vanished keeper confounded those who reviewed the case. Every mechanical and operational detail suggested routine, yet one human life had vanished entirely. The absence of distress signals or unusual activity only heightened the sense that the disappearance was a riddle imposed by the Atlantic itself. Searches yielded nothing. No footprints, no evidence of a boat departure, nothing beyond the lighthouse continuing to operate with exacting consistency, intensifying the mystery. Crews combed nearby rocks and waters for days, but even in calm weather, no trace was found. Investigators examined the lighthouse meticulously, testing locks, inspecting equipment, and questioning neighbouring maritime personnel, all to no avail. The thoroughness of these efforts underscored the impossibility of the disappearance, revealing that the lighthouse's isolation, the ocean's power, and perhaps something unknowable had combined to erase a human presence without leaving a mark. Authorities and historians continue to reference the disappearance, emphasizing the unresolved nature of the event and the impossibility of explaining how a keeper could simply vanish. Accounts from maritime archives highlight the operational continuity of the lighthouse, the dangers inherent in its location, and the psychological and physical challenges faced by keepers stationed there. Boon Island's story became a cautionary tale, cited in records alongside other unexplained disappearances, yet no definitive theory ever gained traction. The mystery persisted as a reminder that even well-documented, historically significant lighthouses could harbour enigmas beyond explanation. His fate remains a lingering question, held in the silent mechanisms of the lighthouse and the vast Atlantic that obscures all answers. The missing keeper of Eddystone Lighthouse. The man responsible for the light was never seen again, and the sudden gap in the station's routine left colleagues and authorities baffled. Eddystone Lighthouse, standing atop a reef in the English Channel, had endured centuries of storms, waves and shipwrecks, yet nothing in its history quite matched the disappearance of one keeper. By all accounts, the tower continued its work without interruption. The lanterns swept the waters faithfully, the rotation mechanism ran as it always had, and the logs reflected meticulous attention to every duty up to the moment of vanishing. Observers could only note the eerie contrast between a functioning lighthouse and the inexplicable absence of its human guardian. The incident quickly became one of the most perplexing maritime mysteries recorded along the English coast, a reminder that even the most engineered and controlled environments could conceal unsolvable enigmas. Engineers and historians later marvelled at the lighthouse's construction, a feat of human ingenuity designed to withstand the relentless forces of the English Channel. The Eddystone Reef had long been infamous for wrecking ships, and the tower's stone and mortar design represented generations of adaptation and innovation. The lighthouse's octagonal base, built to resist crashing surf, and its towering structure rising above the waves, demonstrated an almost defiant mastery over nature, yet it could not shield a solitary keeper from disappearance. Maintaining the balance between mechanical reliability and human oversight required constant vigilance, and the very success of the engineering made the sudden absence of a keeper all the more mysterious. Even simple operations, from adjusting the clockwork mechanism to inspecting the lantern, demanded unwavering attention and left no room for error. The lighthouse's lens, a delicate Fresnel system, had to be polished meticulously to preserve its clarity. Oil reservoirs required careful filling, and the machinery that rotated the light depended on precise timed winding. Slips, falls, or momentary lapses in concentration could prove deadly, especially when the platform above the storm-lashed reef offered no margin for mistakes. The tower's internal stairways, narrow and slick, added another layer of danger to each movement, ensuring that the keeper's responsibilities were never purely mechanical. They were inextricably tied to survival. Endless solitude pressed on the mind, with days passing in near silence, interrupted only by the rhythmic churning of waves and the mechanical heartbeat of the lighthouse itself. Keepers reported the psychological strain of such isolation, where the horizon offered no sign of life for hours or even days. The monotony of the watch, the unbroken sounds of the sea, and the constant awareness of hidden dangers could sharpen nerves to an almost unbearable tension. In this environment, even small decisions felt monumental, as a momentary lapse could result in injury or death, and the absence of a human witness meant that the line between accident and disappearance could vanish as quickly as the tide itself. Mariners navigating the perilous channel depended on the beam to avoid reefs and shoals, yet even the most experienced sailors knew the sea could render caution futile. Merchant ships, fishing vessels and passenger liners relied on Eddystone's light to mark one of the busiest and most dangerous stretches of European waters. Fog and storms could transform visibility in an instant, and rogue waves often swept vessels into hidden shoals. The lighthouse served not only as a guide but as a protector, yet its human element, the keeper responsible for maintaining these safeguards, remained vulnerable to the same elements the tower sought to mitigate. The mystery of the keeper's disappearance underscored the fragile intersection of human endurance and maritime necessity. Eyewitness statements and contemporary logs suggest the keeper vanished between routine inspections, leaving tools in place and the lighthouse fully operational, a disappearance that defied explanation. Colleagues arriving for the next shift found the station in normal order, machinery wound, lantern polished, doors secured. Nothing suggested a struggle, no note or message remained, and no vessel had approached or departed without notice. The contradiction between a perfectly maintained lighthouse and a missing human being challenged understanding, prompting speculation, yet no evidence ever substantiated any particular theory. Each minute accounted for in the logs highlighted the abruptness of the absence and the impossibility of a simple explanation. Extensive searches of surrounding rocks and waters produced nothing. No footprints, no overturned equipment, nothing that could indicate how a man might disappear so completely. Rescue attempts, patrols and investigations by neighbouring maritime stations yielded only frustration and an intensifying sense of the incomprehensible. Storms and tides had been considered as possible explanations, but the absence of debris or disturbance suggested that neither had played a definitive role. Authorities catalogued the case meticulously, yet every entry emphasised the same anomaly. A keeper had vanished while his station continued to function flawlessly. Documents preserve the event as an enduring mystery, highlighting both the dangers of the channel and the vulnerability of those who tend lighthouses in isolation. Accounts from maritime authorities, historians, and lighthouse enthusiasts describe the disappearance with meticulous detail, emphasising facts over speculation. Eddystone Lighthouse itself remains a symbol of human achievement against nature's fury, yet it also stands as a silent witness to lives that could vanish without a trace. The story of the missing keeper is cited repeatedly as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even in controlled, engineered environments, the ocean holds powers beyond comprehension. The light of Eddystone sweeps across the dark waters, indifferent to the vanished keeper and the questions that will forever drift unanswered in the channel's depths. The disappearance at Little Brewster Island Light. Harbour authorities noticed something unusual when routine checks of Little Brewster Island Light revealed the keeper had missed a scheduled inspection. The station, situated on a small rocky outcrop at the entrance to Boston Harbour, had always operated with meticulous precision, and any deviation from established procedures immediately drew attention. Officials quickly realised that the absence was not a simple oversight. The lighthouse continued to operate as normal, its beam sweeping over the harbour with consistent timing, yet the human presence responsible for its care had vanished without warning. This early recognition set in motion a tense series of observations as the authorities confronted the unsettling possibility that a man had disappeared from a location meant to be under constant surveillance. Examination of the station's logbooks uncovered minor irregularities, entries left incomplete and tasks seemingly interrupted in the midst of performance. The meticulous routines that kept the lighthouse functioning smoothly, such as cleaning the lantern, winding the rotation mechanism and recording precise observations, had been adhered to up to a certain point, only to stop abruptly. Investigators noted that there were no signs of struggle, no overturned tools, and no clues suggesting an accident within the small station. The logs hinted at continuity in operation, yet the keeper himself had become a ghost, leaving behind only careful documentation of work partially completed. This paradox heightened the sense of mystery, emphasizing that whatever had occurred did so, without leaving the traces one would normally expect in an emergency. Attempts to reach the lighthouse by signal and ferry proved unsuccessful, underscoring the vulnerability of a station cut off by water and weather. The approach to Little Brewster Island Light was complicated by tidal currents, submerged rocks, and unpredictable winds, making any visit a calculated challenge. The ferry operators and signal crews reported repeated attempts to communicate with the station, yet no response was received. Even with favourable conditions, crews could only observe the functioning light from a distance, unable to confirm the keeper's presence visually. This lack of immediate verification created a creeping tension. A man had vanished in plain sight, the station continuing as if no one had been missing. Fishermen and harbour pilots began reporting subtle anomalies in the beam's sweep, noting moments of hesitation that suggested the keeper was absent. Although the light continued to fulfill its duty, experienced mariners could sense slight irregularities in its rotation and intensity, tiny fluctuations imperceptible to the untrained eye, but enough to cause concern among those who relied on its precision. These observations spread quickly through the local maritime community, reinforcing the alarm already felt by authorities. The possibility that the station's caretaker had disappeared while the lighthouse appeared fully operational created a dissonance that was both confusing and unnerving. Search boats were dispatched immediately, combing the surrounding waters for any sign of the missing man, but every effort returned empty-handed. Crews meticulously examined the rocky shoreline and nearby waters, navigating currents and hidden shoals with caution, yet no evidence of the keeper was discovered. The lack of any physical trace, no footprints, no discarded equipment, no indication of an accident, added to the intrigue. Investigators were left with the troubling reality that the lighthouse had remained functional, while the individual entrusted with its maintenance had vanished completely, challenging conventional explanations and fueling the growing sense of uncertainty. Despite the human absence, the lantern rotated faithfully, its oil reservoir full, and the mechanical systems functioning as though tended by unseen hands. The tower's engineering, designed for resilience and reliability, was performing flawlessly in the absence of its keeper, emphasizing the oddity of the situation. Instruments recorded the sweep of the light and the proper operation of its mechanical components, yet the human element that ensured everything ran smoothly was nowhere to be found. This disjunction between flawless operation and missing personnel created a tension that gripped both authorities and observers alike, highlighting how a disappearance could occur even in a highly monitored and meticulously maintained environment. Veteran keepers reflected on the isolation inherent to the station, where endless hours of vigilance could erode both routine and resolve. Lighthouse service, especially on remote posts like Little Brewster Island, demanded unwavering attention to detail in both calm and inclement weather. Loneliness, monotony, and the weight of responsibility could affect the mind in ways difficult to quantify, and while there was no evidence of voluntary abandonment or distress, the psychological strain inherent in such duties remained an unavoidable context. These reflections offered a human dimension to the mystery, emphasizing the pressures that accompanied the keeper's disappearance and underscoring how a single anomaly could unsettle an entire system. Ships passing the harbour depended on the lighthouse's consistent signal, navigating narrow channels where one lapse could have disastrous consequences. Merchant vessels, ferries, and fishing boats relied on the tower to mark dangerous shoals and reefs, and even a brief misalignment or failure could have resulted in catastrophic accidents. The operational continuity of the light, in contrast with the absence of its human steward, emphasized the precarious balance maintained between human diligence and mechanical reliability. The keeper's disappearance, while mysterious, had fortunately not coincided with a maritime tragedy, yet it amplified the awareness of how critical these stations were to harbour safety. Records of Little Brewster Island Light trace a history of solitary service and intermittent challenges, embedding the current disappearance in a long tradition of maritime uncertainty. The lighthouse, operational since the early 18th century, had withstood storms, wartime threats, and technological transitions, all while relying on the diligence of individual keepers. Previous incidents had tested both the resilience of the structure and the fortitude of those who served there, yet none mirrored the peculiar circumstances of this case, where a functioning station coincided with a missing keeper. Historical accounts framed the disappearance not as an isolated accident, but as part of the enduring narrative of human vulnerability amid essential maritime infrastructure. Local newspapers and official documents captured the intrigue of the event, preserving reports that emphasized the puzzle rather than speculating wildly. Accounts recorded the continuity of the light's operation, the absence of physical evidence, and the procedural measures taken by harbour authorities. Writers noted the contradiction between mechanical precision and human absence, describing a mystery that confounded conventional explanation. These records ensured that the event remained part of Boston's maritime history, offering both contemporary observers and future historians a detailed perspective on a case that continued to perplex. Days turned into weeks with no sign of the keeper, leaving an unresolved question that even the most experienced maritime authorities could not answer. Follow-up inspections confirmed the lighthouse remained in full operation, and the absence persisted without a trace or clue. The mystery endured in the official documentation, witness recollections, and anecdotal accounts passed through the harbour community, becoming a case study in both the perils of isolated service and the limitations of human observation. In the absence of closure, the narrative of Little Brewster Island Light remained suspended between diligent operation and unexplained disappearance. The lighthouse, perched on its rock and surrounded by water, continued its silent vigil, a steadfast guardian of Boston Harbour amid an inexplicable absence. Its beams swept the night sky, offering reassurance to passing vessels even as the question of the missing keeper lingered unresolved. The station itself stood as a reminder of both human ingenuity and human fragility, a structure capable of maintaining order in the midst of uncertainty, yet powerless to illuminate the fate of the man entrusted to it. The beacon rotates unceasingly over the dark harbour, illuminating the waters while the fate of the vanished keeper remains a mystery. The keeper lost at Talray Lighthouse. Isolation weighed heavily within the stone walls of Talray Lighthouse, where a solitary figure vanished without explanation while tending to the tower's ceaseless duties. The lighthouse, perched on the windswept sands of North Wales, had long served as a critical guide for ships navigating the Irish Sea. Its light had warned mariners of treacherous shoals and hidden sandbanks for decades. Yet one day, the man charged with maintaining that beacon simply disappeared, leaving no trace in a mystery that would linger for generations. Many hours of monotony and vigilant attention pressed upon him, each day blending into the next with only the glow of the lantern and the distant cries of seabirds for company. The work demanded constant awareness, and isolation sharpened the mind while simultaneously fraying nerves. Solitude at the lighthouse was a test of endurance, and even the most disciplined keepers had been known to struggle with the psychological strain of living alone in such an unforgiving environment. Every sound, every shadow of the wind or surf became amplified in the quiet of the tower. A single misstep along narrow stairways or slick platforms could have proven fatal, yet no evidence pointed to an accident or struggle. The interior of the lighthouse revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Tools were in place, oil reservoirs full and maintenance logs up to date. Windows were intact, doors secured, and the lantern shone with a steady sweep over the dark waters. There were no footprints on the sand or rocks below, and the surrounding tide left no hint of struggle. The disappearance remained a riddle, because even the harshest conditions had left no sign of what might have claimed him. Routine tasks, polishing the lamp, inspecting lenses, and recording observations required exacting precision and complete focus. Each task was designed to ensure the light functioned without interruption, and any error could jeopardize the safety of vessels far below. The keepers rotated through duties, climbing stairs, winding machinery, and checking structural elements of the tower. These responsibilities might have seemed mundane, yet on a day with shifting tides and gusting winds, even simple actions demanded extraordinary care and balance. In this landscape of constant vigilance, the human element was always vulnerable. Talray Lighthouse guided vessels through dangerous stretches of the Irish Sea, its light a critical beacon across waters filled with hidden sandbanks and unpredictable currents. The region had long been notorious among sailors for sudden squalls and shifting shoals, which could catch even experienced captains off guard. Over the decades, the lighthouse had saved countless lives, and its presence was considered indispensable. That a keeper could vanish while fulfilling this essential duty added an almost mythical dimension to the event, transforming a man's disappearance into a symbol of the sea's unyielding power. When signals went unanswered, colleagues and authorities scrambled to locate him, only to encounter silence where presence had been expected. Boats were dispatched from the mainland, searching the shoreline and rocks surrounding the tower, but no signs of the missing keeper emerged. Observers reported nothing unusual, and even the most seasoned sailors could not explain his absence. The lighthouse itself continued its work without pause, the beam cutting across the dark waters as though mocking the searchers who sought answers from a sea that revealed none. The lantern continued its rotation, machinery running flawlessly, giving no hint that the human attendant had vanished entirely. The intricate gears and weights operated as always, producing the sweeping arcs of light necessary to warn mariners. The tower appeared untouched by misfortune or disruption, leaving investigators puzzled. How could a man disappear in full view of a functioning lighthouse, with all duties performed and no sign of an accident? The contradiction was impossible to reconcile, heightening the mystery and embedding it in local maritime lore. Fierce tidal surges and sudden waves pounded the surrounding coast, creating an environment in which one lapse could erase a person from view in an instant. Rogue waves, powerful undercurrents, and jagged sandbanks made the waters surrounding Talray particularly hazardous. Even the most cautious keeper risked being swept away while inspecting the exterior or tending the lantern. Yet, investigators found no evidence that such a catastrophe had occurred. The sea, always a constant presence, had claimed no trace of the missing man, leaving only questions and conjecture behind. Local fishermen and passing ships noted subtle irregularities in the light's sweep, small enough to escape immediate notice, but enough to raise uneasy questions. Some described slight delays in the signal or minor flickers, though these could not be definitively attributed to human absence. These observations filtered into maritime records, adding a layer of intrigue to the disappearance. Sailors who relied on the beacon for safe passage began to regard the lighthouse with a mixture of reverence and apprehension, aware that the man who ensured its operation had been taken without warning. Formal searches and inspections yielded nothing, revealing no trace on the rocks, in the waters, or inside the lighthouse. Teams combed every crevice, checked tidal zones, and meticulously examined the tower's interior, yet every effort proved fruitless. Reports documented each step of the investigation, emphasizing the meticulous condition of the lighthouse and the complete absence of evidence for an accident or foul play. Authorities could offer no explanation, and the incident was quietly filed among other unresolved maritime mysteries along the Irish Sea. This disappearance became part of a broader pattern of unexplained vanishings along the Irish Sea, embedding Talray in a long history of maritime enigmas. Lighthouse keepers had long faced isolation, extreme weather, and the psychological strain of solitary duty, and occasionally individuals disappeared without explanation. Tales circulated of missing attendants at other stations, yet Talray's case remained one of the most perplexing, both for its complete lack of clues and for the lighthouse's unwavering operation. It served as a reminder of the perilous intersection between human duty and the unpredictable forces of nature. The lighthouse carries on its work, a silent guardian against treacherous waters, its history marked by the absence of the man who once maintained it. Its beam continues to guide vessels safely past dangerous shoals, indifferent to the unanswered questions and unrecorded fate of the vanished keeper. Talray remains a place where mystery and maritime necessity coexist, and the story of a single disappearance echoes across the sands, carried by the wind and waves. The light sweeps faithfully across the Irish Sea, yet the man who once tended it has vanished into the tides, leaving only questions that linger with the wind.